Happy New Year, Reverend Janelle Riddick. I believe it's been some time since we've spoken. So just want to say happy 2016 to you. Thank you so much for your work ethic and the way in which you have submitted all three sermons. So I appreciate your timeliness and the way in which you have honored and been committed to getting your work in on time. Thank you so much, and just again appreciate this effort. Just a few comments about Sermon 3, God's Grow Up Plan, taken from Luke 22 and 42. And I'll just start with the sermon, and then I'll talk about the reflection paper, your learning covenant, and also your PPG report as well. But let's just start with the sermon. I like the idea of God's Grow Up Plan and maturation and development, ways in which we can mature and grow, and then especially ways in which you talk about the importance of looking at difficult circumstances as opportunities for our growth as well. So again, appreciate that and the thought, very clear, your idea, your thesis, where you're headed with this sermon. You ask a relevant question, it appears. How do we grow up in light of the cup? And so how do we grow up in light of difficult circumstances and in light of challenges in life? And very simple response, you provide us a yet, meaning how do we function even when we don't get our way? And then a yes, how do we learn to trust and surrender, and the power of a surrendered yes. And so again, very clear, your thesis, your main idea, your relevant question, and you synthesize it by answering the question in two ways, with a yet and with a yes. So thank you very much in that regard. I would think a little more exegetical work would have helped. It's a very familiar passage, and oftentimes when we have these very familiar passage and these texts that have sort of been preached ad nauseum, we try to find, well, what's some new learning, what's some new information that we can glean from these texts. But I think really solid preaching really helps the audience to look again, to take a second, a third, a fifth, or eighth look at a very familiar text, and to find some way of unearthing some hidden jewel. And so I think it would have helped to just add a little more exegetical work regarding context, what's going on as Jesus is having this struggle of yet and yes. How does the context in Luke sort of connect with Luke's overall message or Luke's overall audience? Perhaps how is Luke's version of the story different from what we find in Matthew and Mark? So are there some sort of synoptic differences? And are there some synoptic parallels as well? How does John, if John offers any help or assistance with this passage as well? So a little more exegetical work. It's particularly, again, when you're dealing with passages that people sort of have a sense of groundedness and familiarity with. But again, the beauty of preaching is helping the pew to unearth that which they perhaps have gleaned over or glossed over in many regards. Your speech, your tone and voice exuded much fervor, much excitement, and a great deal of eye contact. You seem to be quite comfortable and familiar with the sermon. Much interaction and engagement with the sermon, and I could see, yes, some growth in these areas, realizing that, yes, you've been sort of wedded to your manuscript, but I was delighted to see the degree of comfort and ease with which you were able to sort of get away from the manuscript and even move from behind the pulpit and sort of the work that you were doing with the sermon beyond the manuscript. So again, a great deal of growth in that regard. The imagery, the figurative language, the sort of the parallelism of, yes, human growth, spiritual growth, the use of the Gerber commercial in that regard, and the ways in which you talk about human development vis-a-vis spiritual development, and how it is that we grow and develop even during difficult times. And I think it would have also to help to address how it is that even when things are going well, how those can be also moments of maturation, that those can be those times in which there's sort of a slow kind of growing or slow kind of development. The alliteration of yet and yes, and the way in which you have this kind of sonic effect with these particular words. I would have wanted a little more, I guess, new material as it relates to any kind of references to books, quotes, and poetry. I noted in your reflection paper you mentioned that you had a quote from MLK that you forgot because, again, it wasn't in your manuscript or somehow just got away from you. But I think it is important to give people something to say, well, oh, let me go look that up, or let me go research that, or I'd never heard of that, or I'd forgotten about that. And so always including some new learning, some new material, a book, a quote, or something to sort of urge people on and to edge them to do a little more. I couldn't help but to think, as you were holding your hands up and talking about surrender, I was waiting for you to say something about Michael Brown and what happened in Ferguson, and sort of like the power or even the danger of having surrendered hands. And so I thought about, Michael Brown with his hands up, and really even the power of his surrender, how it really sort of started the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement that really came after Michael Brown surrendering, but yet he's killed as a result of his even or in spite of his surrendering. And I think the parallels there, that, how it is that the death of Jesus and his surrendering gives life. In the same way of Michael Brown, his death, his surrendered hand, sort of birthed and gave life to a Black Lives Matter movement. So I thought about that and thinking and looking at you embodying the surrendered hands and what that means. So appreciated that as well. Again, the connection to human maturation, your personal references and talking about your brother and your children and all of that. So again, just a great way of sort of, I think, embodying and helping people to see what happens when there is spiritual growth, and how there are aspects of spiritual growth that are in many ways synonymous with our own sort of physical and human growth. So well done. Appreciate the sermon and the energy, and was glad to see that the people came out in spite of the snow and the holiday weekend. Let me now talk about a little bit about your reflection paper, and where you talk about the sermon correlating with your overall church theme, the challenges of growing up, the project group, and how they're moving towards kind of objective sermon observation. And so you talk about their assisting and helping you to understand growth, and you reflect on this in this reflection paper. You noted in the reflection paper the distinctions of the first two sermon over against this third sermon. And so how it is that sermon 1 for you were focused on the people doing something, some action that they needed to take. But with sermon 3, there was more of a kind of internal focus, if you will. And so I wanted to say then, well, how is it that you could really begin to incorporate more this kind of maturation and this own growth and the challenges that you see for yourself in sermon 1, sermon 2, and in sermon 3. So I think a little more of that could have been fleshed out as you talk about in your reflection paper. Another thing, it would have been helpful, I think, and it's something that we can continue to talk about for the next couple of years. How have the 3 sermons assisted you with your overall theme for your project? So if you're talking about, compartmentalization and a holistic approach, then if you were to look back and sort of say, then how did sermon 1, how did sermon 2, how did sermon 3 help you to progress towards your overall preaching project? Or did it, begin to stir some things into you that you perhaps want to change in light of your preaching project? So as we go forward, continue to sort of grapple with the ways in which you see the sermons assisting in your overall sermon project. The Learning Covenant, just a couple of things here. You noted in the Learning Covenant that you said Sermon 3 will address the communal necessity and responsibility to act. But as you've noted in your reflection paper, you went inward and not outward for this Sermon 3. So how do we find a way to synthesize and to say, well, wait a minute, I thought I was going to do one thing with Sermon 3, but I ended up doing something else. And so how can we sort of, converge, merge? How do we, again, synthesize what you thought would happen with Sermon 3 versus what actually did happen with Sermon 3? Additionally, let's make sure that there's something in the Learning Covenant that addresses your own attempts to get away from the manuscript, or to depend less on the manuscript. So we want to make sure that you address that as a part of your own learning goals and your own learning outcomes throughout the remainder of this project. And then lastly, your PPG report. I appreciated the kind of different assignment for the group. And so this time they're giving the questions beforehand, and you thoroughly noted the ways in which their assignment was a little different, that they were to be a little bit more objective, and how they really assisted you in coming up with this idea for this kind of God's grow up plan and spiritual growth and development in many regards. It seems that your use of imagery and figurative language were paramount to the members of the PPG. And so there are a lot of ways in which they sort of resonated with this idea of development and meat and surrendering, and a lot of the visuals that you provided in the sermon. So that seems to be a way in which you sort of catch people, and perhaps a way in which you can sort of build on that, the use of this figurative language moving forward. I would also think it important that as you go forward with this PPG, that it's important to push them to reflect on how they believe your sermons are different. What levels of growth, what levels of, maturation do they see from Sermon 1 to Sermon 2 to Sermon 3, or from Sermon 1 to Sermon 3. So what are the ways in which they can sort of help you track and trace your own level of homiletical development in so many regard, that they can give you more feedback on what needs to improve and what you need to develop. So there's not a lot of that there, but I think it's important going forward that you really use the eyes and the ears that you have in this PPG group to assist you in monitoring how your sermons are changing or ways in which they need to change. Thank you so much, Reverend Riddick, again, for your hard work, for getting this in on time, for getting all of your sermons in on time. I look forward to reading your integrative paper and to what the next months, to what the next years will bring in this relationship. If you need me or have any questions about anything, or if it's not clear what I've written in this evaluation of what I've said here, please don't hesitate to email me or to call me. Blessings on your snow day. I pray that your family is safe under all the feet of snow you all are getting there. Ironically, in Chicago, we've only got maybe a half an inch or two. So there you go, the irony of the weather indeed. Blessings, Reverend. Take care, and I look forward to what's next for you. Bye-bye.